Hello, welcome to Advanced Facilitation. So hello to people listening to me around the state and people who are with me here. It's really weird doing it both, so forgive me if I'm sort of got mixed focus. So this session is really short and sharp for me because this is giving you a taster of a full day workshop that I do for the Department on Advanced Facilitation. So this is a bit of a taster. I've taken a little bit out to give you an idea of the things that we cover and to also look at the other things that you might want to tap into if you come along to the session. So it's a whistle-stop tour, I guess. So I'm going to start off with a bit of an activity, and for those people listening out all over the place, you might want to just do this as well. I want you to think about the teaching methods that you use the most often in class. So those things you feel comfortable with, you use all the time. Just have a bit of a jot down or a chat with the person next to you. Think about any methods that you'd like to use more often. Is there something you'd like to get a bit better at or integrate in a bit more frequently? So just have a quick think what you're using and anything you'd like to use about more frequently, more often. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to share your ideas, jot your ideas down, and then we'll come back and have a quick share. Anyone just want to share with us things they'd like to try a bit more often or do better?
Using technology.
Technology. So what type of technology? Anything specific?
I'm open to anything.
Anything. Just integrating technology more into your practice. Yep. Okay. Thank you. Lady at the back.
Little video clips of little examples of language in use.
So like model examples of things in practice. Yeah.
But lots of them.
Lots of them. Yep. Good.
Laurie talked earlier, I'm coming to that basic and work in
Okay. So a bit more hands-on. There's no backwards or forward steps. There's just things we can choose, absolutely. So a wide variety. And it's interesting that people say, you were saying about the old methods, back to basics. But really the technology is really just a vehicle by which we can do the same sorts of stuff in many ways. So I think every instructional method has a place and has value. It depends how we use it, when we use it, and for who we use it with. So the idea of this workshop or this session really is to just get you, and I feel like it's pillars stuck in the middle here, but is to get you to reflect on your current practice. So where are you at? What would you like to extend and look at? But also then to really deepen some of your knowledge about instruction. Because every day we go into classrooms or we go into workshops or we'll start working with students in online environments, and we tend to move into this default method. We just use what works without really thinking about why am I using it? Could I do it differently? Is this actually meeting the needs of all my students? And could I do it differently? And I think from my own personal perspective, your own challenge just to try something different. You get bored doing the same stuff over and over again. You want to extend yourself professionally. So we look at how the methods that we use are associated to different theories of learning. So we have a bit more of an in-depth, we go a bit deeper with this and look at what they're connected to and where they come from. And we also, I think about what would be appropriate for me. So in the session, we look at a whole range of different things and we discuss them and get to play with some ideas. But also to think about what would work for my learners, because we all work in different contexts, we all work in different situations, so what would work, what wouldn't work. So it gives us that professional space to think about these things and have these conversations and plan for how you might use these things in the future. So here are the theories of learning that we look at, and this sort of structures the session. Now, you might have heard of some of these, some of you might have already. I've got to move back, I've gone out the way, I'm trying to avoid the post. But some of you may have already heard of these. I'm sure for most of us in the room, we're familiar with adult learning principles because most of us work within that environment. But there are lots of different theories about how people learn and different strategies that are attached to them. So what we do with each of these is have a quick look at these theories. Where do they come from? What are they telling us about how people learn? And also about the teaching methods that are associated with them. So what you find is different approaches will say, well, this method works best, or this is more effective for this type of learning. And we look, most importantly, and that fourth dot point down for me is really important, because who succeeds and who struggles as a learner. So I don't do very well with rote learning and repetition and drill because I've got cognitive processing issues. And so if you have learners that have problems with those, they struggle. I have to make connections, I have to experience things, I have to actually talk about things. Some learners like to look at things, they've got great memories, drill and repetition works really well. So it works different for some learners. So some of us are going to be more predisposed to using certain methods because they work for us, and then we wonder why they don't work for all learners. So we want to look at which learners succeed with different types of teaching methods and theories and which learners struggle, because if you find that learners are struggling, think, how could I teach this differently? What other theory might I draw from to help this particular learner? So this is what we look at in the session. Around behaviourism, we look at good old, and this is probably the one that most of us went to school on. So this is the good old days when we all sat in lines and we all sat individually and things were drilled and repetition. We learnt times tables and spelling, and we had explicit teaching and direct questioning. Now there's nothing wrong with those methods. They're really effective and they have a valuable place. And if you look at some of the most recent theories on learning, there's been a big call back to those sorts of approaches, because in some ways there's only certain content that we can learn by practicing it, by repeating it, and by rote learning it. So we look at behaviourism. We look at cognitivism, and the example that we're going to use today, we're going to have a quick look at cognitivism ourselves in this session. And that's really about, interestingly, how the brain works. How does that, if you like, that function of the brain take information in, how does it store it, and how do we retrieve it? And what strategies are really good for helping learners with those skills? So we look at things like using mnemonics, which most of us went to school with when we remember rhymes and poems and acrostics. We look at chunking and think out loud strategies that you can use for those students, which work really well for modelling and demonstrating processes and steps and stages. We'll have a look at constructivism, which I think most of us are familiar with, very contemporary education theories and approaches. So constructivism is really concerned with building learning and having discovery learning and inquiry and problem-based approaches to learning. And it sits in really nicely with andragogy, or adult learning theory. So that has a very similar approach, but in that what we do with adults is the idea is we take off the direction. So we open up the space for adults to negotiate with us, to talk about things. And we look at things like open space technology, negotiated learning tasks. So all of these theories, if you like, have different strategies and different approaches and different ways of thinking about things. So we've looked at a whole range of different theories, and we've looked at a whole range of some of the things that we might actually be looking at. So I've got a quick activity for you at home and here. And I've got a range of different instructional methods, if you like, listed there on the right-hand side. And I want you to just think about ranking them on your tables or having a quick chat. Which do you think are the most powerful strategies to use in terms of helping students take information in and retain it? So which do you think, from your experiences, from your own personal ones and from your teaching, do you think are the most powerful? And then think about why. And I just want you to rank them from those that are the most powerful to the least. I'll just give you a few minutes to have a quick go. So this, you may have seen this around. So they assume, if you look at the ones, I mean, it's the other way around, but they assume that like the more passive the method, and by passive we mean you just sit and absorb it. And what they do is, how they test this is they will go and give the information or content in a number of different ways. And then what they'll do is test learners for their retention immediately after, and then they usually come back about 3 or 4 weeks and test them again, and then in a couple of months test them again, and they actually compare and look at it. And what they found is that the more passive the method, the average retention rates decrease. The more interactive the method, and you're quite right, teaching others always comes out as the top one, because if you think about the cognitive processes involved, you know, you've got to get your head around it. We do this all the time, to then teach it to someone else, and then I have to, that's a very high cognitive level to actually understand it, to be able to explain it, to summarise, to demonstrate sometimes. And you're quite right, I think it's very interesting that you've all picked up on, is that we tend to do more of that stuff at the top often because of time. It's not as if we're not committed to these, but we know that, oh, if I just do this, then, you know, I'll get through it quicker, or maybe they've condensed the content. So what we're trying to do is to think about putting ourselves in the learner's position, because you can take any content and you can deliver it in a whole multitude of ways. I could do this in a whole different range of ways of doing it. So we need to think about, well, what's going to be the most powerful? And how can I integrate these? But it's also about being pragmatic. We can't go in every day and set up great things where we have interactive stuff and we're learning and we're teaching each other. It doesn't always work for the context or the situation, but it's important for us to be mindful of those things. And there are different strategies that you can use that might not be as intensive as, intensive group discussions and practice. There are different strategies you can use. So, in terms of a bit of a taster, I'm going to sort of jump into looking at one of our learning theories, which is cognitivism. So before we have behaviourism and constructivism and adult learning theory, which we look at in the session, but I'm just going to give you a quick taster of this and how we go about doing it. So when we talk about cognitivism, I usually when I look at any of the theories, I'll introduce you to two key players or two learning theorists in the area and give you a bit of a sort of potted version of what they believe and what their research is, and then we'll look at some methods. So the two that we have here are probably the only two in the presentation that are still alive and kicking today. Most of the others are all dead. But Jerome Bruner and Albert Bandura are still alive. And both cognitivists. Now, cognitivism arose is part of constructivism, and the basic underlying principles is that we have to interact with our environment to learn. Behaviourism couldn't care less. You're all rats in boxes and I can punish you or I can reward you and you will learn. But when it comes to cognitivism and constructivism, they say no, learning's more complex than that. We need to interact and we need to experiment and engage with our environment. So both of these gentlemen were cognitive psychologists and come from a psych background. Now, these are their two models, and I won't, bore everybody or see the lights go off with them. But what they believed in, if you like, is really about looking at how learning occurs. So in terms of Bruner, he said that there are actually three modes of learning that as humans we adopt. We can have an inactive way of learning, so we interact with things, and it might be a book or action or pick something up. And we do a lot of this when we're very young. So young children learn like this. We interact with the world, we pick things up, we taste them, we smell them, we see how they work, we pull them apart. And they call that inactive learning. So as we get older, we're able then, our brain becomes more sophisticated and it's able to understand symbols. And so we can learn through looking at pictures and images, and they call that iconic learning. And then as we move into more advanced years, we have what he calls symbolic learning. And he says that the learning can become more abstract and we can learn through researching, through reading, through talking to other people, and we can develop our own hypotheses. And the idea is that as we learn, we can become more sophisticated. Our brains develop and we get better at these things. Now, when I speak to teachers and say, so really all the people we teach should be in this symbolic mode, I get lots of shaking of heads going, I don't think my students have quite made it out of this one to that. Which is because we're all at different levels and we're all doing different things for different reasons. And one of the key things that's happening in our culture at the moment with a lot of visual culture and sort of in technology is we do a lot of iconic learning. So pictures, images, symbol, that sort of stuff. In terms of actually learning through abstract symbols, that can be limited. But if you think about using your iPhone or your iPad, that's all symbol systems that have different meanings. So technology is mediating the way we learn and interact with these types of things. Bandura's is much simpler. He just basically says that a person, in order to learn, needs to interact with their environment and display certain behaviours. So it's this interaction between all of these things that occurs. Now, what all cognitivists are interested in is the brain. So all of them are interested in how that brain works. How does it take information in? How does it store it? We know we can interact in different ways, but how does it get in there? And this is a really nice, neat model that some of you may be familiar with called the information processing model. And what it suggests is, and it uses a metaphor, if you like, of the brain like a computer. So the idea is, if you think about your head as being the hard drive, information comes in from our environment. And it comes in through all of our senses. So our sight, sound, we hear things, we taste things, we smell things. That's how our brain gets information into it. Now, you can see there, we've got all that information coming in. But depending on how that information comes into the brain, depending on what type of person we are, what sensory preferences we have, whether we're a Vivian and we like to learn this way or that way, that's the first out of the brain. So you can be giving information to your students, and if it's not presented in a way that they can actually get it, or it's their preferred learning style, or they have a certain preference another way, or a learning difficulty that impairs this, that information drops out immediately. You don't even get past first base. It's interesting to think about. Now, hopefully it gets past that, and hopefully what I'm saying to you right now is going into your immediate memory, and that's our first port of call, if you like. Now, the immediate memory's only got a short span. It can only hold on to certain amounts of information for certain amounts of time, and if it can, after a while, drop out, because we can only hold on to certain chunks of information. Hopefully though, if we can discuss it and talk about it and interact with it, we can get it into the working memory. The working memory is like your desk. You might have piles of stuff that you're working on, and you can keep 7 or 8 things going simultaneously. And hopefully what we want to do is get it into this long-term storage system, or the hard drive of the brain. And that's that retrieval thing where it gets stored and we can pull it up and retrieve it and use it as and when necessary. So what we're trying to do with our learners is get all that information into there so they can use it in the future. Now, there's lots of out points, and the biggest thing in terms of that is self-concept. So if you have learners that have had really bad experiences of learning, they don't have a very good self-esteem or self-concept of learners, if they've failed or they don't think they're any good or they've been told by teachers they're useless, that significantly affects their belief system about themselves and directly impacts long-term storage. Because if you believe you're no good at maths, you're no good at maths, and all your past experiences tell you you're no good at maths. And your brain is wired in that way, so it becomes very difficult to repattern and help learners through. So that's the idea of the model and how it works. And what they suggest is that learning is essentially about mental processing. So we need to think about the brain as a computer, and we need to get information in that way. We need to present knowledge to learners in symbols and pictures. We need to give them lots of different ways to interact with it. And what we're trying to do is change a learner's schema, or sort of their pattern of something. So a schema is a very simple concept. If I say to you a car, we all have a schema of a car in our head. We know it's got 4 wheels usually, and we know what it looks like, and it drives on roads. So when you look at a new car, you just assimilate that into your schema of cars. Now, if you think about learning something new, which we're often in the business of teaching, we often don't have a schema for new information. So connecting it to what learners are familiar with in the initial stages is really helpful to them, because it can then build on their existing schemas. So here's some of the strategies that they suggest we use. And you've probably used some of these, or you may have seen them at school or seen your kids use them. Modelling and demonstration, and some of you picked up on this, are classic cognitive systems. To see something modelled and to watch it and see it happen, and having somebody think out loud or talk through how they're doing things is a really useful strategy for learners. They get to see that. Whether it be online, even with language learning, you can use YouTube clips to have something modelled and spoken to them. It's the same process. Giving students the opportunity to practice and be scaffolded and guided as they're learning is really important as well. So watching and having an expert helping them, giving them things in steps and stages. So chunking information to students is something that's really useful to them. We are experts in our areas, and we have this whole raft of knowledge that we sometimes just dump and forget what it's like to go right back to the beginning and build up gradually and slowly. And so pulling right back and looking at those things is really useful. Using advanced organisers, and that's a posh way for saying you either give them, this is what we're going to be doing today. So you give them the heads up. Here's the steps or the stages. Here's a model example. Here's one I prepared earlier. That helps put into someone's head, oh, this is what he or she is looking for. This is what we're going to be doing. So it puts in that mental model in the head. Getting students to set goals, which I've heard is a challenge, is with my own students at university, and self-reflection. How do you think you went with that? So for those of you who know me, you know my vocational area is vet nursing and animal care. And so often I'll be working with students who are carrying out procedures or processes with animals. And my first thing I say to them as they're doing their practice is, how do you feel you went? What went well? What didn't go well? Where do you think you might improve? So even the questions that I'm asking is I'm getting them to cognitively self-reflect on their experiences and what they've done. So these are great strategies. So we need to think carefully about how we actually do this. If we give a lecture, we give information, or we give visuals, we need to back it up with practice or discussion. So even just a quick think, pair, share on information or discussing things. If you don't have all that time to do the in-depth stuff, just giving them that time to consolidate it is useful. So we lose information if we don't practice it. It goes. It just doesn't retain, because our working memory and our immediate memory just can only hold on to so many chunks of information. So just as you might be thinking about getting home, doing the shopping, feeding the kids, what you're going to do on the weekend, your students are the same, particularly if they've got their phone with them. So we need to make sure it's encoded in that long-term belief system. So we're going to look at some strategies, and I think before I move on to look at these and let you have a play with some of them, we need to think about the actual amount of information students can take and how we present it. Miller's law is the work that Miller did in the early 1940s, cognitive psychologist, which said, you know, we can really only remember about around seven chunks of information at any given time. If we've got a really good memory, maybe an extra 2 either way. So just present information slowly and give it in steps and stages. And think about, you know, these issues of, has it actually got in there in the first place? Has it dropped out at any point, and where do I need to go back? So, long-term storage, to get it into there, 2 questions that the learner will ask. Does it make sense to me? Because if I don't understand it, it's not going to go in there. And does it mean anything to me? Is it relevant? Do I need to remember this? Or we can give it a helping hand, if you like. So this is terrible light to see here. I didn't realise it was so bad. But we've got 3 methods here. We've got rehearsal, elaboration, and organisation. And these are called encoding strategies. And all of these are designed to get information into the brain and keep it there. So I know you probably can't see that, it's terrible, but the rehearsal is things like repetition, drill, highlighting, note-taking, copying, practice. And then we've got things like elaboration, using keywords, imagery and association, and think out loud strategies. And then for organising information, we've got chunking and concept mapping and mind mapping, setting out plans, diagrams, charts. Any sort of graphic organiser is a really useful chunking method. When we create lots of pathways to things and we work on what works for us, we have more neural connections in the brain. So if one pathway gets broken, the others generally will see it through because they've got something to hang it on. Now, association is great for remembering long lists of stuff, and I had to do a lot of that at school when I was, especially in high school. But I'm not saying that we use it a lot, but there are certain things that we teach. You know, if you're teaching nursing or you're teaching language or you're teaching vocabulary or those sorts of things, there are some things we just have to learn. It's just the way it is. So association is one way that we can do that. And I use association a lot because I have to remember lots of theories and lots of theorists, and the way that I do it is to visualize and picture them in my head and have different weird associations. One of the things that I'm personally really interested in is quantum mechanics, and I read a lot about it, but I'm completely mathematically challenged and hopeless and don't get a lot of the concepts. But in order to remember things, I have this weird little man with a hat, and he has, you know, ducks that come out that are quarks from a hadron hat and all sorts of weird things, and I'm using association to remember that I wouldn't remember it on its own. So it's a very powerful strategy. Does anyone use it or have used it or seen it yet? Yeah, it's a good one. All right, so you can associate objects in a number of ways. You can wrap them around, you can stick them together, and if you use something that you're familiar with, like your house or a person or somewhere you like to go on holiday, it can work really well because you know those well. You've got that anchored in your brain. So there's lots of ways that you can use association. The other one that I'm not going to look at, we discussed this, we decided not to use a chunky one, is to look at chunking information. I'm going to show you some ways you can use this. Chunking, as I said earlier, is really, really useful when you've got to teach students lots of different information and new information. So if you're teaching things like maths formulas or processes, if you have to teach anatomy and physiology in nursing or anything like that, if you have to teach parts of something like an engine or a machine or a tool or steps or a process, chunking is really useful. And so if you think about chunking, if you think about the first time you came to learn to drive a car, you've got lots and lots of different things going on in that car, and you have to remember lots and lots of different things. And it's really hard to think, how on earth am I going to coordinate all this stuff simultaneously? And it's really difficult at first. And so we have to think about how all these individual things work together. And that takes us time, and it takes us practice. And we need to understand each individual one before we can put the big picture together. So some ways you can use chunking. I've got some here from anatomy and physiology, so if people are nurses or come from a nursing background or chemistry, biology background, this type of stuff is very common. Learning each of the different systems individually first, before you start thinking about how each interacts and counteracts and works with another. That one on the right-hand side is the parts of an engine. So you might learn transmission first, then you might learn, air conditioning systems. So there's different parts of a car. How do those fit together? So remembering each one individually and introducing them gradually. So letting students master one before they move on to the next one. Often what we will do is put up a picture of a car engine with all the different parts and systems fit together without pulling them out and looking at each one separately and scaffolding that information. If you have students having to do extended pieces of writing or learn how to write reports or anything like that, doing these nice visual diagrams of writing essays and actually giving them a template of where the information goes is a really good visual planning tool that students often remember when they come to actually planning. Even if they can remember that sort of way of planning it and structuring it, it gives them an advanced organiser of what's expected, and it helps them plan. Things like fishbone diagrams, mind maps and concept maps are brilliant because they separate all the information and pull it out for students. Flowcharts, another one. If you've got procedures and processes, flowcharts are another fantastic way of getting that information out. And resuscitation charts, that again is chunking information. You might use an acronym for that, and we chunk the information. So there's loads of ways that you can use this, and it's thinking about how you might integrate it into the content that you teach to support learners and to aid that long-term storage. And of course, we've got good old mnemonics, which I have some great sheets on all the different things you can use for Ohm's law and planets and just about everything. And often I've come across vet teachers who develop their own for different subject areas that they teach to just help remember things. I've got some in vet nursing, particularly with looking when you're actually examining animals for kidneys. You've got right in front and left behind. So you sort of know where to go. So you have those different cues to remember where things are. So as a closure, I'm going to get you to just show how much you've sort of got into that long-term memory. I'm just going to share a quick strategy with you called pass out the door. It's a nice sort of retention thing. And what I want you to do, or your pass out the door for today or to leave, is on your table you've got some Post-its. So I'd just like you all to take a Post-it. And you can, on your Post-it, just write one new thing that you've learnt in this session or a new strategy that you plan to try out in your teaching. So you just want to share with your colleagues what you've got, and thank you, and hopefully I might see you next year either face-to-face or on the webinar. Thank you very much, folks.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.